This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at Kevin Kautzman and at Brad Kelly. All right, and this is the Art of Darkness podcast with your hosts, Kevin Kautzman and Brad Kelly. Brad, how are you?
Great, man. Yeah. How are you?
I'm doing real well. I am going to consider tonight's episode a success if we can do two things. One, I want to pronounce our subject's name, his full name, without sounding like a complete tool. And two, I want to get through the night without, wittingly or not, committing a pun.
You want to get through it without making a pun.
Without making a pun. For example, we would not want to say we're going to have a wild time tonight. For instance, we're not going to do that.
Okay.
Right?
Hey, good. Okay, I'll try to stick to that one.
Right.
No
definitely.
promises on the pronunciation, though.
Yeah, so tonight's episode is about, let me pull it up because I need to see it in front of me to pronounce it here. One moment. The full name is Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. Let me try that again. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde.
That is quite a name.
Yes, born on the 16th of October, 1854, and died rather ignominiously at age 46 from meningitis on the 30th of December in Paris in the year 1900. So tonight is going to be about the great poet, playwright, influencer, lifestyle influencer.
Oscar O'Flaherty.
Oscar Wilde, correct.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah, right. Oscar Wilde, yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'm excited. Before we dig into it, this is, of course, the Art of Darkness podcast. You can find us at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter now at artofdarkpod. And I want to say that we are completely unqualified to do this podcast. We are not professional historians. I have a degree in history for what that's worth. Brad and I both have master's degrees in creative writing. We're artists, and so we're coming at it from that angle. Is that fair to say, Brad?
I think that's fair. I have a bachelor's in English, so okay. I'm an English bachelor, and both pretty well-read people. So
we're as qualified as anybody in America in 2021 to do anything.
Right.
Seems like nobody. Yeah. Right.
In this time of failing trust in experts, we are also experts. So take that as you will.
I think what I'm saying is you can feel free to yell at us if we get something wrong on Twitter.
Sure.
Certainly, and look us up. You know where to find us.
We could use the engagement, so go for it.
Absolutely. We welcome your venom, whatever you're feeling. And I think, to quote Oscar, he said something to the effect of, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about.
Yes.
So this is an incredible writer and a person in whose wake we really dwell. I think it would be fair to say that this is a Wildean age in the sense that and we'll get to all of this in time, but he really put the individual first in a way that the Victorian society at the time certainly did not. So let's dig in and drive through some of his life. So he was born in Dublin in October of 1854. He's an Irish poet and playwright. His life was to make him one of the most popular playwrights in London, but it took quite a while to get there. His parents were Anglo-Irish, and they were intellectuals. So here's a case of someone coming from a family where this is maybe not completely out of left field. He isn't an autodidact. He's not self-taught by any means. He let me actually get to. There's a good website that I found that kind of takes you through the point by point his life. So he was born. His father was I think an ophthalmologist. He's like an eye and ear doctor, a doctor of some sort, and very well-to-do. I believe in one of the pieces that I read or I looked at claimed that his father set up his own library. Or something to that effect. I mean, we're talking or hospital. I think it might have been.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes. So, right. He was the forerunner of the Dublin Eye and Ear Hospital.
Yeah, and in those days, medicine was a little different, right? So being a doctor, it wasn't long before that where you could just declare that you were a doctor, I think.
Right. You had a knife and a good bedside manner.
Yeah.
You were taller than everyone else.
Yeah.
I'm the doctor.
I'm the doctor. Everybody kind of just went along with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so just like a podcast, I'm a podcaster.
Right.
William, here it is. William Wilde was Ireland's, and I'm simply reading from the wiki here, Ireland's leading ophthalmological surgeon, and he was knighted in 1864 for his services, in Ireland. He wrote books on the subject, or rather on the subjects of archaeology and peasant folklore. And this milieu that his parents sort of set up for him, his mother would run salons and things. He was around the literati and the intellectual set, of Dublin at the time. So he was sort of steeped in all of this from a pretty young age. The idea of society. He was certainly a society person. Although being Irish, as we'll discover a little later on when he was to come to London, there were all sorts of implications, to
Absolutely.
that, without a doubt. His father was a bit of a rake. If I'm not mistaken, his father had 2 children out of wedlock. And so this rebellious kind of, I don't want to say the word, this wild streak sort of, God, you know what? It's going to happen. It's inevitable. Sort of, ran in the family. He was baptized, Anglican. Although throughout the course of his life, he had, and we will come to this near the end, he had a very serious flirtation with Catholicism, and I believe even converted kind of finally at the end. And
there is something Catholic about his writing, and I don't even know what it is exactly. But yeah, if you would have told me he was a Protestant, I would have been surprised.
Indeed, yeah. I think there's a feeling of that. Well, I mean, he's culturally extremely Irish.
Yes.
And that Irish identity is so sort of tied up with Catholicism that even, maybe the way that, Catholics in America are all kind of Protestants, there's no way out. You sort of have a similar thing going on here. Mm-hmm. So let me see. I want to sort of see if there's anything else in his. So let's talk a little bit. He was born. He attended the Torah Royal School for Boys, which sounds quite fancy. We can fast forward a little bit. He got into Trinity College Dublin, which is the college, the university in Dublin and in Ireland to this day. Mm-hmm. He was awarded the Royal School Scholarship to attend. He did very well in classics. He studied Greek, and if I'm not mistaken, French. He was completely fluent in Greek, to the point where he, in 1974, he won the college's Berkeley gold medal for Greek, and he received what's called a demiship scholarship to Magdalen College at Oxford. Which means that I believe half of his tuition to Oxford was paid. I don't get the impression that the family would have struggled to pay for the whole thing, but it's a matter of sort of status.
Yeah. So we're talking no lightweight in just probably the raw IQ department.
High verbal IQ.
Yes.
And came right.
Which is obvious in reading a paragraph of his, but yes. Yeah.
Without a doubt. There's a little bit here that I don't want to miss. He became associated with the emerging philosophy of aestheticism, which, if you had to describe aestheticism, how would you describe it, Brad?
Well, I don't know much about the capital A school, philosophical school of aestheticism. It sounds to me like it's a sort of neighborhood of romanticism.
Hmm.
So it obviously raises aesthetics to a high standard. There may be something about finding truth in beauty, something along those lines.
Art for the sake of art.
Okay,
We're not doing anything political with art. In the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is the novel that made him truly famous, although he was famous to a point prior to that. In the preface of that, he famously wrote that a book is not moral or not. A book is either well or poorly written, something to that effect.
Yeah, see, that's a man after my own heart.
So we were doing the thing for the thing. And there's this whole thread of thinking that follows us to this day, where there's this idea that the artist creates himself. I don't know the source, but in my digging this past week into this, I believe he said something to the effect of the best thing a writer can do before becoming a writer is to become famous for something else.
Oh, could you imagine Oscar Wilde on Twitter? See that? Yeah.
Right. Well, in the format of our show, I think I might have missed a beat. Where this is the second episode. So, Brad, if you had to describe Oscar Wilde prior to going in deeper to this, what would you describe?
Yeah. So, as somebody of Irish descent, he is an attractive figure to me because he's one of the people you point to when you say Irish people are good at talking and writing. Yeah,
Hello there, Brad Kelly. Yeah.
Right. So there's a handful
one
of
writers.
One
of us.
Of us. Exactly.
Yep. Big time.
But a bit of a dandy, just a razor sharp wit. His an amazing playwright. I saw The Importance of Being Earnest at a Shakespeare festival someplace, and was maybe my first real exposure to him, and was just bowled over by the pace of it. So my first exposure to him was this like rapacious wit, basically, and very familiar with Picture of Dorian Gray. But beyond that, about his life, I don't know a whole lot other than it sort of devolved into scandal later on.
Right.
And we'll get there. I don't want to spoil it for anybody who doesn't know it, but his fortunes took a pretty dark turn.
About as bad as one could expect. Extremely bad.
Yeah.
Our previous subject, Burroughs, literally got away with murder, manslaughter,
yes,
and
many other
Wilde,
things,
right? Oscar Wilde did not fare so well, and we'll come to that in the third act of this episode. I think in this episode, because they're so great, I'm just going to smatter in some of the quotes, the little epigraphs that he wrote, these little witticisms. Always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much.
Tweet.
Yeah. Send tweet. Right. We're never going to cover anyone who would have been more effective on Twitter.
Yeah. No.
Right now, he would be on Twitter peppering scorn at blue checks.
Right.
He would be laughing and completely murdering them.
Be on his third or fourth handle.
Well, or I think he'd have one of his own, but he would be a subject of some concern. Yes. So I'm going to read two more quickly before we get back into his life. Be yourself. Everyone else is taken. This is great. This is a very funny one. All women become like their mothers. That is their tragedy. No man does, and that is his.
That's pretty. It's funny, but it's kind of deep. And
that, if I'm not mistaken, is a line from The Importance of Being Earnest. Okay. Possibly. One of the plays. He would use these lines in the plays, and they would become these sayings, and they would, where most people would hope to get one great line. You can't handle the truth. His plays would have boom, 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 just firecrackers. He was famous for his witticisms. He was famous for his poetry. He was famous for The Picture of Dorian Gray, for this novel. And maybe I'll let you describe that when we come to it, Brad, what you remember of it. He was famous for 4 major plays, principally. And then he also wrote a prison letter, which is incredible. And then finally a poem of about a hanging, which was his final work. And again, we'll come to all of that. So getting back to the timeline, he was at Trinity, where he rubbed shoulders with Walter Pater and John Ruskin. You familiar with these?
Ruskin rings a bell, but I don't.
Yeah, these are the fellows, they're essayists, writers, big shots. This would be the equivalent of someone now going to Yale and then going to do graduate school at Harvard or something, because he goes on to Oxford. One of the fun stories of his time at Oxford is that I believe it was Oxford, he intentionally was seen to not be working. He didn't want to appear to be too busy with himself, with his studies. And then at the end, he completely crushed and surprised everyone, which I think is kind of wonderful.
That's a good move.
Tells you a little bit about him. Yeah. He had a flirtation with Freemasonry while he was at Oxford, but that passed. This is when Catholicism became quite, interesting to him. I think he was nearly confirmed, if I'm not mistaken, but he backed out at some point for, which I'm sure somewhere deep in his soul, he knew this is probably not something that I'm really able to commit to, at this point. It's interesting because when you think about Oscar Wilde, you think about his work as a writer, you think about his homosexuality or his bisexuality, but the religious stuff, as so often happens when we talk about these figures, kind of gets lost. But if you are, after listening to this episode or in your own time, going to take it upon yourself to check out De Profundis, again, the prison letter. There's a wonderful reading of it online. You can actually find a reading that Patti Smith did of the entire letter. It lasts over 6 hours.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes, incredible. I listened to the one that was done by Neil Bartlett. Religion plays a huge role in his thinking and his,
It is interesting how we sort of forget an artist's religiosity, sort of spiritual journey, and it will be sort of mentioned as a footnote. It'll be like, oh yeah, by the way, he or she was a practicing whatever, and as though it doesn't inform everything that they're doing.
Yeah, it really is telling in our time how kind of
it's presented as an oddity, and he also golfed. That's kind of weird. Like it's at that level of
right. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm reading a little bit about him at Oxford. He wore his hair long, openly scorned manly sports. So when you said earlier he was a bit of a dandy, this guy was the dandy. He was the arch dandy.
It's too bad there was not color photography around. Right. Because didn't he wear pink?
He was very famous. He was very flamboyant. And so he occasionally boxed, and boxing is going to come into play here later when he meets Bosie, the lover who would ultimately ruin him. Bosie's father was the Marquess of Queensberry, and the current boxing rules are still they go back to the Queensberry boxing.
That was
rules.
His father was
that Wilde picked the wrong young man to have an affair with.
I did not know. I knew it was some heavy, I didn't know that. Just quick side note. If you ever watch the Mike Tyson Mysteries, one of the main characters of the Mike Tyson Mysteries is the ghost of the Marquis de Queensberry. It's very random.
Well, that's perfect. That's perfect. Well, so at Oxford, he decorated his rooms with peacock feathers, lilies, sunflowers, blue china, and object d'art. He once remarked to his friends, "I find it harder and harder every day to live up to my blue china." The line became famous and became a slogan of the aesthetes. So these were the young ne'er-do-well individualist, bucking the trend of conformity and all the rest. In a funny way, these would be like the Tekashi 6ix9ine, not quite as hardcore, but it's that type. It's that these darn kids, who do they think they are? It's that, but in academia, kind of flying at the highest levels of society.
Do you think there was any moment of like, I've read moments, bits of David Bowie's life where like one day he's like basically like this androgynous weirdo who everybody kind of threw rocks at, and then a year later everybody's dressing like him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. How dare he? And that is the reaction he wants. And before you know it, he's getting all the attention.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you brought up Bowie, who will eventually attempt to do. It's occurring to me we may need multi-part episodes.
It's possible for some people. Yeah.
Yeah. At some
round
juncture.
2 later. Yeah. Yeah.
There is zero way you miss the line between Wilde and Bowie, and really Wilde and our entire and rock and roll, our entire age is a Wildean age. So we're still with him at Oxford. He was introduced there to the joys of the Greek ideal. So this notion of neoclassicism, we're bringing back the Greco-Roman ideal of beauty. We're opening up the stuffy drawing room, and we are going to remove all of the sort of the dust, and we're going to look back to that golden age of Greece. And statuary and all the rest. Kind of everyone would have been influenced, I'm pretty sure, by Nietzsche at this point. Nietzsche is kind of in this period. He, according to several biographers, he expressed delight in other men's beauties and brilliance. He wrote of the pleasures of strolling around the grounds, being among his peers. Of course, there were only men at the school. And he developed what you would call a Hellenistic ideal of joining love and intellectual passion and intellectual growth. And this was something that would come back later in the trial that he would face. His defense had something to do with a poem that I believe Bosie wrote, or someone in that milieu wrote, about the love that shall not be named between older men and younger men and even boys. So we absolutely have to drift away from the pederasts.
We're going to get episode 3 will not be about a pederast, I promise.
Right. And again, we have to tread lightly here. Oscar certainly did enjoy the affections of boys, but we're talking about 18, we're talking about 17, 18 years old here. And this eventually would lead to his downfall, but not before he would be married and happily enough and have 2 children as well. So
I didn't even know that. Okay.
Yeah. So there's this image that floats around of Oscar Wilde. There are a couple of misconceptions. He went to prison for homosexuality. Well, for sodomy. Yes, technically, but as we'll see, there is a lot more to that. He certainly could have avoided it, and we'll get to that. The other sort of idea is that he was homosexual, and I think you could probably make an argument that he was bisexual potentially. I think Earnest, real biographers would probably have a deeper appreciation for that, and probably differing opinions, because who really knows his heart? But I mean, he did really claim to love his wife.
A lot of men throughout history and even to this day have sort of hidden their homosexuality in a marriage with a woman. But to me, it seems like, from not knowing that much about him, he's such a self-possessed person that he wouldn't marry someone to kind of hide in it, if that makes sense. And I don't know what went into it, but it seems to me like he would be the kind of person who's like, well, maybe not outwardly gay, because that was so difficult to pull off, but at least not pretend he was something completely different than what he was.
I'm not a scholar of the period, but the impression that I have is that everyone looked the other way. as is so often the case with such things in history.
Mm-hmm.
You had these winks and these codes. I mean, even in our lifetimes, Brad, there was a certain, you just kind of, it doesn't really affect me too much. We'll kind of look the other way. I think there was a lot of that happening, especially in the bigger cities. And of course, at this point, the French had a much different attitude to things than the English, which we'll ultimately see. Okay. So before he left Oxford, he won the Newdigate Prize. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, for his poem Ravenna, and that reflected his visit there the year before. And he read it at the, what would you call it? What do we call it when everyone leaves the university? They have a fancy word for it. Yeah, graduation. There you are. We're some commencement. Poets. Yeah, commencement, exactly. Yeah. So he read his poem. He graduated in 1878 with a double first, so crushed it with his BA in classics, basically the greats. So if you're one of these people who thinks we have to completely eradicate the canon, well, maybe not. Oscar Wilde studied it. If it was good enough for Oscar Wilde, maybe we should revisit learning Latin, Greek, and the great poems of the originators of Western civilization, if we hope to be in dialogue with it, or even to have one. In any case, he wrote to a friend that the Dons are astonished beyond words, the bad boy doing so well in the end.
Yes. Oh, he must have loved that so much.
Yes, right. Yeah. So you create a stir. You are surprising everyone. He was an imposing figure. He was over 6 feet. Okay. He was a brawny fellow. Yeah. It's saying here that at Oxford, he was once physically attacked by a group of 4 fellow students and dealt with them single-handedly.
Nice.
So not an airy-fairy, fluffy lightweight either. Could handle himself. Yeah. Very funny. Right. So he we'll leave Oxford shortly, but it's saying by his 3rd year, Wilde had truly begun to develop himself in his myth, and considered his learning to be more expansive than what was within the prescribed texts. So he was rusticated for 1 term after he had returned late to a college term from a trip to Greece.
What does rusticated
mean? I don't know. It seems, rusticated, they use it at Oxford, Cambridge, and Durham, means to be sent down. You're expelled.
Oh.
So he was expelled for a semester.
Wow. Because he just rolled in late. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So, not entirely playing by the rules.
Yeah.
So that now we're going to move away from the period of schooling. Before we do, I think we should indulge ourselves in a few more quotes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Life is far too important a thing to ever talk seriously about. There's a certain amount of misogyny in this. But I'm going to read it. A man's face is his autobiography. A woman's face is her work of fiction.
Oh my
God. Yeah. I mean, these are things we could not get away with anymore.
Yeah.
But this is so wonderful. I'm going to read 2 more. Morality is simply the attitude we adopt towards people we personally dislike. And this is another one. And he was not shy about his own brilliance. He said, I am so clever that sometimes I don't understand a single word of what I am saying. I mean, what fun.
Yeah.
I think there's an awful lot of dolorous kind of sadness about Oscar. There's this narrative that, oh no, he was ruined because of his affairs and everything. It's so sad. And it's like, well, yeah, but I mean, of all the playwrights you'd like to have to dinner.
I was going to say, he's got to be among the best dinner guests. And imagine when he was young, 20, 22, going to the pub with Oscar Wilde must have just been a riot.
You're in Oxford, everyone's having fun.
Yeah.
And you just start randomly, reciting poetry, but it's contextual.
Right.
And perfectly appropriate. And it's not about, if it is about jockeying for position, it's all in good fun. Yeah. So wonderful. So now we're getting into the idea of his debut in society. So he came back to Dublin.
So was he? I'm sorry. Was he right? Is there evidence? Well, he was writing poetry, obviously, but was he dabbling in while he was at Oxford? Was he dabbling in writing
plays? I couldn't answer that, but I don't. If he was, they never saw the light of day.
Okay, fair enough.
I do recall in my studies of him that he did have, I think, 2 or 3 aborted plays that never received a production before he wrote Lady Windermere's Fan, which was the one that put him on the map in that context. And we'll come to that. So long story short, he spent some time in Dublin, and then he, with the last of his inheritance from his father's house, from the sale of his father's house, he set himself up as a bachelor in London. Swing in London, 1881. The census lists Wilde as a bachelor at 1, now 44 Tite Street, Chelsea. So you're right in the heart of it all. And Frank Miles, a society painter, was the head of the household. He had been publishing lyrics and poems in magazines since entering Trinity College. So like some of our friends from the Michener Center, he had been published in a number of magazines and chapbooks. He's sort of building his name. He was 27 years old when he published Poems that collected, revised, and expanded his poems. The book sold out its first print run, 750 copies. It was not well received by the critics. Magazine Punch, for example, said, "The poet is wild, but the poetry's tame."
Oh, God.
So here we are, unavoidable.
Yeah, and poetry, I think it's important, and anybody listening to this probably knows this, but it's important to think about how the different role that poetry played in society at that time versus now. Poetry now, there's great poetry coming out, but it's a bit of a it's a bit of a candle making, coopering barrels kind of thing. It's a bit obscure. The most famous poet, the most successful book of poetry that comes out now is gonna, it's gonna sell in the tens of thousands of copies probably. And I'm not celebrating that, but in that time it was a major player on the artistic scene.
It would be comparable to being a major hip hop artist. You'd be like, if you were a hot poet in London, you'd be like Kanye or Jay-Z or something. So I think that it's interesting. So it sold out, but this is interesting. By a tight vote, the Oxford Union condemned the book for alleged plagiarism, and the librarian who had requested the book for the library returned the presentation copy to Wilde with a note of apology, which must have stung.
Who did he? And I'm sorry if you didn't investigate this too deeply, but who was he plagiarizing from? Supposedly,
I think they would have suggested it might have been other students. Would have been my guess.
I see. Okay.
Because of course this would be like somebody saying, "Oh, you're a joke thief. We were doing open mics together, and you stole a joke." Right. That would be my best guess.
Yeah.
One reader said that in his poem Hellas, there was a sincere though flamboyant attempt to explain the dichotomies the poet saw in himself. The line was, "To drift with every passion till my soul is a stringed lute on which all winds can play." Ooh. So no slouch here. Yeah. We're seeing the sort of the move towards something. It had a further printing in 82. It was bound in a rich enamel parchment cover embossed with gilt blossom, and it was printed on handmade Dutch paper. So I'm sure all by his direction.
Oh, yes, right. I'm sure. It might have been his favorite part of the process.
Absolutely. So he's kind of self-printing this stuff, and this is who I am, and I am a poet now, and I live in London, and so forth. So now this is where it gets interesting. I mean, I hope it's already been interesting, but I find this fascinating. Yeah. So aestheticism, with this movement that he had become the living embodiment of, living in London with his background in education, mildly famous, a figure for this movement, the dandy's dandy. It was sufficiently in vogue to be caricatured by Gilbert and Sullivan in a play called Patience. And an impresario based on this. So we should talk briefly about the play Patience. It was a comic opera, and it's a satire of the aesthetic movement. So, it was about fads, superficiality, vanity, hypocrisy, and pretentiousness. And they more or less put Oscar Wilde into the play, right? So he had so associated himself with this movement that that people saw Wilde in the play. They are saying here that the identification was retrospective, but in any case, this play was a big enough hit, this opera was a big enough hit, that somebody invited Oscar Wilde to do a lecture tour of the United States, of North America.
Wait, so they were basically trying to lampoon him, and he used it to get more famous.
Absolutely.
Nice.
He is the example, the arch example of someone who's like, no press is bad press. The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. And here he is being talked about. And so this figure invited him to do the tour, and it was priming the pump for the US tour of Patience, right, and selling the most charming aesthete to the American public. So I'm sure the thinking went something like, the Yanks have all the coin, right, or have a lot of money. We know this play, it has legs, but they need to know what we're
making fun of.
Right. And so Wilde went along with it. And
Wilde's like, that sounds, you're going to pay me and people are going to clap at the end. So,
and it was a huge hit. It was supposed to last 4 months, but it went on for a year. He's doing
he's got the line between what he was doing right there and stand-up comedy. There's got to be a linkage there.
Absolutely. We're talking about, this would be post Mark Twain. So there is a tour, there's a circuit for this. Americans want to come to see the dandy fellow from London who wears carnation or whatever it is, some sort of flower in his lapel, and lives in London and writes poetry, and it's a novelty. But he's also extraordinarily educated. He knows Latin, he knows Greek. So people would come to these tours, and so it lasted an entire month. He very famously, when he landed in I think it was New York, he said, they asked, Mr. Wilde, what do you have to declare? And he said, I have nothing to declare but my genius. We're talking about somebody who I don't even think he's 30 at this point.
Right. I was going to say, how old is he?
What he did with these lectures is he attempted to transpose the beauty he saw in art into daily life. And it was a philosophical project. He was trying to show the Americans, this way of life where beauty could exist for beauty's sake. And of course, we're talking about the rough frontier still at this point. There's a fine film, which I would recommend.
1880 something, right?
1880. And if it's to believe, there's a fine film where Jude Law plays Bosie, and Fry, I can't remember his first name. In any case, the actor Fry plays Wilde. It's like, it was made in the late 90s. It's just one of those great period movies. Does a fine job of taking you through Oscar's scandal and all the rest. And it begins with him visiting a silver mine in Colorado.
Oh, wow,
and he arrives on a horse, and he sits with all these miners, and he explains Homeric poetry to them and why it's wonderful, and they should expose themselves to these things. Just wonderful to think about. How would you like to be a fly on the wall for that?
I would. I mean, seeing one of these lectures sounds to me like that would be a riot. That would be, I imagine, hilarious and enlightening.
Well, now, of course, it was controversial as well. So somebody wrote that his conduct was more a bid for notoriety that rather than the devotion to beauty and aestheticism. There's a cleric and an abolitionist, T.W. Higginson, wrote in Unmanly Manhood that he had a concern that Wilde, that it was his only distinction is that he has written a thin volume of very mediocre verse, and that he would improperly influence the behavior of men and women. So this is Elvis. Right. Elvis has arrived. Young Elvis has arrived, and he's showing you, oh, you can live a different way. You can read Greek poetry, etc. And of course, he's also Irish, which we have a certain there's a biographer who claims that Wilde was the subject of anti-Irish caricature and was portrayed as a monkey, a black-faced performer, and Christie's minstrel throughout his career. Harper's Weekly put a sunflower-worshipping monkey dressed as Wilde on the front of the January 1882 issue. So you have this kind of mixed reception, although certainly they were trying to cultivate that. No press is bad press. The press reception was hostile. He was well received in diverse settings, and I'm reading here, he drank whiskey with miners in Leadville, Colorado, and was taken out to most of the fashionable salons in many of the cities he visited.
Wow, I never would have imagined that he had visited Colorado, honestly.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
It just blows the mind, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You can almost can't believe it. So now he's rich.
Okay.
Right? And so they're saying that he had some income from something called The Duchess of Padua. It's a play by Oscar Wilde. So he must have kicked off his playwriting career at this point, but he's doing well at this point. He's had and if you can, I'm sure it was just like the Beatles. You have this English invasion, this Anglo-Irish invasion of the United States. Now you come back to London and you're internationally known, right? So he comes back to London after an entire year in the United States, and this is where he meets Constance Lloyd, who would become his first wife. And they became married. They had luxurious tastes. They were doing well. They had a reputation for being preachers on the subject of design. And to the point where their own home, they had to set a new standard. They were under the glass, so to speak. And accordingly, the house was duly renovated in 7 months at considerable expense.
Sure.
Yeah. So they had 2 sons together. And this is an interesting factoid. Wilde became the sole literary signatory of George Bernard Shaw's petition for a pardon of the anarchists arrested after the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago in 1886. So playing with fashionable left-leaning politics, if he's associating with Shaw and making these points. So now we're going to move into another phase. And we're gonna get into the juicy stuff.
And when he comes back from, just give me a sense, when he comes back from America, he's 30, 32.
Right. We're talking about, at this point, 1885, 1886, and he was born in 54. So we're looking at a young man in his early 30s.
Wow.
Correct.
Good for him.
Oh yeah. I mean, he did it. He is living the high life. He's got his whole life ahead of him. He has degrees from Trinity and Oxford. He's well loved in the United States by the people, if not the press. And he just has.
You know what? I'd take the people over the press any day of the week.
I don't think you're alone there. And we are rapidly approaching the picture of Dorian Gray. But before we do, let's indulge ourselves in a few more of his quotes. They're so much fun. You can never be overdressed or overeducated. I don't want to go to heaven. None of my friends are there. Right? A good friend will always stab you in the front. Just these, just throw away. And yet they're wonderful. Yeah. You can you can imagine the little book, next to the toilet. And if there isn't one,
I'm going to put one together and make a mint on, Amazon Kindle.
Well, so now we're going to fast forward into 1890 and the year 1890, and he publishes a novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, in Lippincott's magazine. And what do you know? Have you read the novel, Brad?
Yeah, I've read Picture of Dorian Gray twice, and there's not a lot of books I've read twice. The first was in when I was getting my undergrad in English, and I encountered the figure of Oscar Wilde and him being Irish and him being this I'm trying to avoid the pun, but I was very drawn to transgressive figures at that time, and I guess still am. I mean, we're doing this podcast, so I sort of was like, well, okay, what is his most famous work? And I believe at that point I had seen The Importance of Being Earnest and been really impressed by it, and I don't know what I expected reading A Picture of Dorian Gray, but I was overwhelmed by how strong the sentence level writing is. So on the one hand, you have this almost archetypal story. It feels now to mention Dorian Gray, it has achieved this sort of mythological stature, something like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, kind of.
Absolutely.
Where it's just a reference, and everybody kind of understands the vibe of it, even if they don't really know anything about the book. I mean, Dorian Gray is a character in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, for instance.
Right.
Yeah. So it has this stature of like a story that has always been there, kind of.
Yes, and his father had written books on folklore and all the rest. So, do you know? It's funny. It would come back. The novel has this folkloric quality.
Right, yeah, the sort of mythological. Yeah, it's a story that somebody might tell you over drinks, to drive home a message. But it doesn't feel like it has a moral as strongly as the parable version of it does. It's a novel about a not completely un-Oscar Wildean character, Dorian Gray, who is a bit of a socialite and is a bit of an intellectual and is wealthy. And he has somehow, I don't remember exactly how, but has sort of stumbled upon this magic trick of having a picture of himself, a portrait of himself, which ages, and as it ages, he basically doesn't age. So he's a young man in his prime, and there's intimations that he kind of thinks that this will go on forever while the portrait gets older and older and older. And because of this sort of everlasting youth, he, travels, he collects strange things. He expands his intellectual sphere. I believe he becomes an opium addict, if I'm not mistaken.
Sounds right. I didn't reread it, but yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and so, it's a little bit of a morality story in that sense of like, this idea of like, it's driving home this point of you're not going to be young forever kind of thing.
Right.
And you can feel maybe Oscar Wilde grappling a little bit with his own aging process, probably, even though he was still a young man. Fire that burns that hot doesn't necessarily get to burn forever sometimes. So
yes. Well, he was making a case for his aesthetic position.
Yes. Yeah.
And the preface, which I'm going to read a portion of now, caused a bit of a scandal. So he said in the preface, he wrote, "The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or a new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest as the lowest form of criticism is a mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all."
Mm-hmm.
So imagine publishing your novel, which ultimately becomes your only novel, and you immediately take on the critics in the preface to it.
Right.
What are you?
Right.
What are you going to say?
Yeah.
And making your case for your own novel.
And as a writer, I have a hard time disagreeing with any of that. I feel a little alienated by the fact that almost every book that rises to some level of attention now, even if it in and of itself isn't politicized, it seems to be the conversation around it ends up getting politicized, identity politics or whatever. It's like, I don't know about you, but man, I didn't really get into the game of writing. It's not what wakes me up in the morning to try and make some kind of political point.
To move the political football for the Democrats or the Republicans one inch or another, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm much more, I guess, in the aestheticism camp.
I think a lot of people are.
Yeah. It's like, when you were a kid, when I was a kid, I was like, I just want to tell a story. And then, later on got obsessed with words and was like, I want to tell a story and I want to make something beautiful. And the politics stuff.
Even the word beautiful coming out of your mouth in America right now in 2021, it sounds so strange.
Right.
What?
Right. Yeah,
no, everything has to be ugly and annoying and grating, and you have to reflect the horror of the, but there can be beauty in horror.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a ruin porn, right? I mean, there is a beauty in sort of decay and repulsiveness. There's a way to represent it. It's not beautiful, but
so reviewers immediately criticized the novel's decadence and homosexual allusions. The Chronicle, for example, called it unclean, poisonous, and heavy with the mephitic odors of moral and spiritual putrefaction.
Oh my God.
And of course he responds saying, if a work of art is rich and vital and complete, those who have artistic instincts will see its beauty, and those to whom ethics appeal more strongly will see its moral lesson. He did revise the novel before its publication in 91, because of course it was published in the magazine first. He added some chapters. Some of the more overtly decadent passages and the homoeroticism were excised. Then he added the preface. So that's interesting.
I see. Yeah. I will say, just before we say too much, like from as a writer thinking about the craft of writing a novel, that book on like a sentence and paragraph level is as well written as anything I've ever read.
Yes.
Like, period. It's gorgeous. Yeah. So, anybody out there who's trying to learn how to, get better at writing sentences, you can do a lot worse than carefully reading through the Dorian Gray. And
now, because we're still in wonderful London, one of my favorite cities in the world, there is a plaque that commemorates the dinner between Wilde and Arthur Conan Doyle, and the publisher of Lippincot's magazine. And this plaque commemorates that dinner they had that led to him writing The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Okay.
So, wow. I mean, it's a big deal. This is a good book. It's really worth reading. One final point about it is that the contemporary reviewers and modern critics have postulated numerous possible sources of the story, which I think is interesting. One person argues it's futile. This is someone named McCormick says it's futile because Wilde has tapped a root of Western folklore so deep and ubiquitous that the story has escaped its origins and returns to the oral tradition.
Right. It's like trying to say, well, where did they get the inspiration for Noah's Ark?
Right.
Kind of thing. It's like, no, this is a story that's like too old to source. Yeah.
And I think this is just such a great example of someone who has prepared himself and studied and learned different languages and immersed himself in reading and culture and all of the rest of it, to the point where I would imagine something like this probably came to him in a spurt. Almost like this fugue. I don't know, but you can imagine someone who's just completely in it so much that then when it comes time to sit down and pen the masterpiece, it comes. Wilde himself claimed the plot was an idea that is as old as the history of literature, but to which I have given a new form. So fantastic. So we're gonna talk now about his theatrical career, which leads up to the trial and the dirt, which brings us to the conclusion. So we've got some time left here. So he wrote a number of plays. He's famous for Salome, which I'm not too familiar with. It's a tragedy. It tells the story of Salome, the stepdaughter of Herod Antipas. I'm not familiar with this. This is still performed and done. And I'm much more familiar with what they call the comedies of society. Now, if you leave, listening to this podcast thinking, maybe Oscar Wilde, it's not so much for me, but you need to expose yourself a little bit to the man. If you do nothing else but watch the production of The Importance of Being Earnest, which it's a film. I'm trying to remember the name of the woman who's very famous for her part as Lady Bracknell. Let me see. I should have had that prep, but that's fine. She was played by. Let me find this in the film.
Yeah, I've never seen this.
You've never seen this film?
Interesting to me. I got to watch. I will.
Okay, I got to stop. A handbag? A handbag? She's very famous for that line in the film. Because are you familiar with the plot?
Vaguely familiar with the plot. Very familiar with the vibe of it, I would say. Yeah.
Edith Evans very famously played Lady Bracknell. If I'm not
when
mistaken,
was this film version? I mean,
1952.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It is essential watching. It's fun. It holds up. It's this comedy of manners. It's mistaken identities. Mm-hmm. Most of his comedies function that way. Any ambitious playwright, any new playwright owes it to themselves to watch how these plays function. I saw a very fine production of Lady Windermere's Fan, which I wasn't even familiar with. There's a production that was done by a theater company on the West End of London in 2018. And they recorded it and put it on YouTube. Oh, cool. And it's very good. And it's not just a flat camera. They did some camera work. There's enough where it kind of moves. It's not like watching a film. It's definitely like, okay, I'm watching a play, but it has enough where you kind of get the idea of the plot. And that was the one that really set him on his way in terms of being a playwright, a respected, known playwright in London. And as someone who's had the slightest touch of that, that's a cool feeling. They still respect playwrights over there. And he eventually built himself up to being, if not the most famous, certainly one of the most famous playwrights in London, which is an entree into society and all the rest of it. It would be comparable to being a very, very famous rock star or a rapper or something, and respected and well-loved for the ability to write these stories. Lady Windermere's Fan is this story about a woman who believes her husband, and playwrights need to study this stuff because it's all about the setup, and you sort of keep the audience looking and keep them watching. And it might seem like, oh God, it's so tired. Why would we write plays like this anymore? Well, because they're riveting, because we're still doing them over 100 years later. They're interesting. It's fun. People like to sort of see mistaken identity, and one group of characters knows one thing and another group doesn't know. And
dramatic irony. Lost art.
It is, and it's so silly because it works. It works. It goes all the way back to the Greeks, So, in Lady Windermere's Fan, she thinks her husband is cheating on her. Oh, what scandal! And so now we're getting into sort of what Wilde built his career on as a playwright, and he had been doing it for years, poking fun at society,
it's deeply satirical, right?
Deeply. Yes, and right, and these jokes, the more misogynistic thing that I said earlier, if you lift that and you say that in the dark, you sound like a jerk. But when you say it in the context of a play where one character is making a point about other characters, and the audience is populated by men and women, everybody has a little laugh,
right?
Because it's naughty, and you're not supposed to say it. And half the audience, because nobody, men aren't going stag to the theater, right? We're taking, you're taking your lady, and it's a night out, and so much contemporary stand-up hinges on that. You got to make everybody just a little bit uncomfortable. But in Lady Windermere's Fan, the protagonist, the woman, thinks her husband is cheating on her because he's spending all sorts of time with another woman. Well, it turns out the other woman is this main character's mother. but she ruined herself by having a child out of wedlock. And so they've told her all her life that her mother is dead, but now in fact her mother's trying to get back in touch for various reasons. Totally worth watching. Yeah, right. And it pulls at you, and it's very dramatic and wonderful. So we're getting now to the point where we're gonna flash forward in the interest of time and get to his affair and his meeting with Lord Alfred Douglas Bosie. Now, Wilde prior to this had been having affairs. He'd had male lovers, but nothing like Bosie. Now, Bosie and Wilde struck an intimate friendship. By 1893, he was infatuated, and they had a tempestuous affair. I crunched some numbers, and because what ends up happening, of course, is that Wilde lands himself in prison, and he writes De Profundis, which is a letter written to Bosie.
Okay.
And he talked about how much he was spending on Bosie. Wilde at this time was earning up to £100 a week from his plays.
Oh wow! Okay.
So we're talking money. Rich. Right. I don't know what the equivalent is now, but you can about imagine.
Well, I remember hearing from the same era that £100 for a year was like a significant amount of money.
No doubt. And Wilde was rich, successful. And here comes this younger man. And apparently, I crunched some numbers, and in De Profundis, Wilde claimed that he spent something like $650,000 on Bosie.
Whoa!
A handbag, a handbag, and that's the famous line from The Importance of Being Earnest. If you want to know why we keep doing it, it's because in the play, in that wonderful play, the main character has to explain to Lady Bracknell his origins, because of course for a society woman to give her daughter away, you have to know who you're marrying, right?
How much, the family and
his background, etc. So he goes through this whole rigmarole, and it's one of the greatest scenes in all of drama. It's one of the most comic scenes. But he has to admit that he was a foundling. He was found at the whatever it is, the coat room in Victoria Station, the Brighton line, and she says the line is immaterial. So it's so wonderful. It plays on so many different anxieties. Like he's gonna like he's gonna find his way to some sort of status by saying it was the Brighton line. Clearly it must have come from a good family, Brighton. Something like that. And then and she says, and what was this parcel that they found you in? And he goes, well, a handbag. A handbag. And then she goes on to say, I will not have my daughter marrying into a parcel, marrying into a coat room, just and of course it's so absurd.
Right.
And he's poking fun at this society, which is dying, which is on its way out, right? These are the last throes of that sort of Victorianism. And to this day, this idea of romantic love is something that we still live with. Of course, people make these strategic alliances and have these strategic marriages. It goes on to this day. And you have to be somewhat sensible in marriage, right? You want to marry well, but it's nothing like it was then. And he's poking fun at it, and you owe it to yourself to watch that, if nothing else. It's a hoot. So he's having this affair with Bosie and Lord Alfred's father. So this is another point I think that needs to be made. And Bosie rightly levied this back at Oscar. I think Oscar enjoyed having a love affair with someone with a title.
Probably.
You can think that you're as democratic or as you are, but then when you meet somebody with a title like that, you go, oh, whoa, this is a lord. Even if it's a minor title, there's just this sort of outsider insider thing. It's almost just a way of kind of funnily sort of claiming a prize in a funny way. And I think you could easily levy that against Oscar. He was nothing if not vain.
I was going to say, yeah.
Right.
Certainly being.
If this subject of tonight's podcast had any one fatal flaw, it was his vanity. And of course, I'm sure he would ultimately recognize it in De Profundis. So he's gallivanting around town with Lord Alfred Douglas, who is with Bosie, who is at Oxford in his own right, and that's how they sort of hit it off, right? You're at Oxford. Well, I was at Oxford. This kind of thing still goes on to this day, doesn't it?
So ages here. So just thinking. So Oscar Wilde's late 30s, and
Bosie was born in 1970, and he lived to 1945. So he would have been 21.
Okay, yeah,
21. So this isn't a boy; this is a young man at Oxford, and they're in an affair now. Bosie introduces Wilde to the underworld of gay prostitution in London. And so they are out and about. Wilde is having, gay sex with young working class male prostitutes, rent boys, and with other figures in society. Wilde would meet the boy, offer him gifts, dine him privately, and then take him to a hotel room. So Wilde at this point was definitely stepping out on his wife frequently. And with Bosie, he kind of met his match, and especially Bosie's father, who apparently figures in the Mike Tyson Chronicles.
Yeah.
So
he invented modern boxing rules. So
right,
yeah.
So we're going to meet the villain here. So Lord Alfred's father, the Marquess of Queensberry, was known for his outspoken atheism, brutish manner, and the creation of modern rules of boxing. So you can imagine this is a pretty combative fellow. This is not somebody who's going to roll over. Right. So he feuded with his own son, and he confronted Wilde and Lord Alfred about the nature of their relationship several times. Wilde was able to cool him off. Finally, he in 1984 June, he called on Wilde at 16 Tite Street, no appointment, so Poppin, Seinfeld Poppin, and said to him, "I do not say that you are it, but you look it and pose as it, which is just as bad. And if I catch you with my son again in any public restaurant, I will thrash you." To which Wilde responded, "I don't know what the Queensberry rules are, but the Oscar Wilde rule is to shoot on sight."
Damn.
So very funny.
Yeah.
So this was becoming a very serious problem. Now, to percolate the drama further, Wilde has written his greatest play. He's written The Importance of Being Earnest. It's his masterpiece. If you can do nothing but write one play like this, you're head and shoulders above most of humanity. It was first performed on 14th of February, 1895 at St. James Theatre in London. He was collaborating with an actor manager. They revised it, worked on it, prepped every line. And they constructed this representation of late Victorian society and mocked it. He shortened the play from 4 acts to 3, which is always a good idea.
Yeah.
As soon as the audience pays, the audience doesn't pay to see the play; they pay for the permission to leave. It's quite true. So they're having a huge party, and there's an actor, Alan Ainsworth, who played Algernon, one of the main characters, recalled, "In my 53 years of acting, I never remembered a greater triumph than that first night." And it finally solidified his reception as his best work to date. And it solidified his fame, but not just fame for fame's sake, as a solid artistic reputation. And this play is still rightly performed all around the world. And again, it's just wonderful. Now, at the same time, the feud with Queensberry was escalating, and to the point where Queensberry had planned to insult Wilde publicly by throwing a bouquet of rotting vegetables onto the stage. Wilde was tipped off and had Queensberry barred from entering the theater. 15 weeks later, from one of the greatest triumphs in the history of the theater, Wilde was in prison.
Jeez.
15 weeks later, from standing on stage to an ovation, a beloved playwright in London, he would be doing hard labor. And we're going to talk about how he got there, and that will bring us near to the conclusion. Let's read a few more fun little pithy sayings to kind of
take it up before we bring it down.
Yeah. Oh, this is a good one. I am not young enough to know everything. This is wonderful. And this, again, you talk about Bowie, I think a bit, and obviously he's not very well liked right now, but Marilyn Manson, right? Mm-hmm. This idea of the bad boy, this is very much what he cultivated. Here's a quote. You will always be fond of me. I represent to you all the sins you never had the courage to commit.
Oof.
Right?
Yeah.
Amazing. One more. Two more. Experience is merely the name men give to their mistakes.
Ooh, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. One more. I never travel without my diary. One should always have something sensational to read on the train. I'm pretty sure that's from Earnest. Just wonderful, right? And it's worth saying, if you're a writer, boy, and I'm reminding myself right now, keep a little notepad around and let these little things percolate and come to the top. Yeah. All right, so we're approaching the trial here. I'll attempt to keep it somewhat short. Long story short, and this is the subject of a great deal of the Wilde biography. If you watch a film about Wilde, or you read about Wilde, or you hear about Wilde, this tends to be what people fixate on. Now, English law is different in the United States from the United States around libel. Libel is still a really serious thing in the United Kingdom, and you can really be dragged into court over it. In the United States, it takes a lot more for that charge to stick. I'm not a lawyer, but we have the First Amendment, and so our speech is protected, and so libel is libel laws are a lot weaker. Wilde, so the Marquess left his calling card at Wilde's club. So everybody has clubs in London; they still do. The Albemarle, and he inscribed his card saying, "For Oscar Wilde, posing Somdomite," and he did misspell it for whatever reason. Now, maybe he meant to do it, maybe he didn't. In any case, I don't think he was the sharpest attack in the box.
A lot of blows to the head, probably.
Yeah, right. Now, Wilde was encouraged by Bosie, and against the advice of his friends, he invited a private prosecutor, or a prosecution against Queensberry for libel, since the note amounted to a public accusation that Wilde had committed sodomy. Queensberry was arrested for criminal libel, which is a charge that carries up to 2 years in prison, or carried up to 2 years in prison at the time. Wow. So Wilde and his young lover, who was estranged from his father, who despised his father,
and who were
Sodomites.
We're right. Yes, exactly. Committing sodomy on a regular basis.
Big time.
Yeah.
Right? Now,
and not that there's anything wrong with it.
No, not that we would never, of course not. But this, if this podcast does nothing else, I do want to push back against the notion that Wilde was a victim entirely here of these laws. He himself would eventually reflect in De Profundis that his mistake was appealing to the society that he had made a living standing away from and mocking. He appealed to the courts, and of course it was not going to go his way. In hindsight, it's absolutely crystal clear that he was on a fool's errand here and being marched off a cliff. And Bosie was playing the fiddler. Quite tragic in hindsight. Wilde could have avoided this. And of course, many, many thousands of people were imprisoned on these awful laws. And it's needless to say, we live in a better time in that respect. But it isn't so cut and dry that they caught Wilde with a rent boy and dragged him down. That was a thing that could have been hushed up This was, again, a society where this was winked at. You kind of would, especially at this level, right? Well, we're just not going to talk about it. Okay, there's a poofy playwright. Well, okay, they all are.
He's making a lot of people a lot of money.
He's making a lot of people
like him.
Exactly. Right. He knows lords and ladies. Right. So this wasn't a minor indiscretion. This was involving himself in a feud with a lord who had invented the rules of boxing. So ill-advised.
Yeah.
So now Queensberry could avoid conviction of libel only by demonstrating that his accusation was true, and furthermore that there was some public benefit to having made the accusation. His lawyers then hired private detectives to find evidence of homosexual liaisons. Not too difficult to find. His friends told him, Frank Harris told him, his friend, they are going to prove sodomy against you.
They're going to prove sodomy. They're going to prove sodomy. They're going to prove Gomorrah.
Poetry. Right.
Nobody even knows what that is.
New kinds of sex that we don't even aware of. Yeah, you're done. You're going down, son. You don't know. You're up against a character in the Mike Tyson Chronicles. And his friends advised him to flee to France. And this reminds me of Socrates. There's a quality here where you're dealing with a condemned man who could have gotten on the boat to Calais and gone to France and lived in exile, waited for it to cool off, written his plays, and been fine. But of course, this man is a fixture in London. He just had one of the greatest opening nights in history, and his family is there, and so he was quite incensed. And George Bernard Shaw witnessed the scene of his friends trying to interfere, and he just didn't do it. So now,
do you think there was some ego involved in that? There must have been.
Huge.
Right. Okay.
You're a nothing. You may be a lord, but I am the king. I am the Celtic king of the London theater scene. Right. And I will stand up to this, to your bullying. Right. So again, I think he's on the Oxford Yard, and the bullies are approaching, and he stands his ground, and he fights them. So this image of him is like kind of a frail, fairy, kind of airy fairy, not correct. Yeah. But to the world of the Victorian underground, his association with blackmailers and male prostitutes, cross-dressers, brothels, it didn't take long. Yeah. and they were coerced to appear as witnesses because they were accomplices as well. So they leaned on these people. I assume maybe a little money changed hands. These are probably not very expensive people to bribe. And the trial opened, and the rest is history. Yeah. The opposing prosecution, Carson was a fellow Dubliner who had also attended Trinity. He handled the cross-examination, and they used his literature and his writing against him. This lawyer tried to justify Queensberry's characterization of Wilde by quoting from Wilde's novel, referring to a scene in which one of the characters explains his decadent philosophy to Dorian, an innocent young man. And then it wasn't very difficult for them to bring forth these lower class men, these rent boys, and that did not go well. And so Queensberry clearly wins, and the defense leaves Wilde bankrupt because of the laws. So now Wilde has lost it all. Including the rights to his plays.
Whoa.
Everything for accusing. The stakes could not have been higher. About the only thing they could have done to him that would have been worse is death, the death penalty, or more time.
See, in my head, when you said, he brought libel laws, and it's like, okay, well, he can't prove that. To me, it's like, well, it's a lawsuit that just didn't go well. But, it had a cascading kind of effect. Yeah. It
says here, Queensberry's acquittal rendered Wilde legally liable for the considerable expenses and that left him bankrupt.
Wow. Okay.
So terrible. And so now we're in court because Wilde is dragged to court for sodomy. And gross indecency.
Yeah. It's not, sodomy isn't as fun when you're talking about it in court as it is when you're doing it.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, and this must have been surreal for Wilde, because we're talking about as high as you can get to about as low as you can get. And now your dirty laundry is being aired in public and you're being accused of buggery.
Right. Right. Oof.
So this is just tragic, because his friends told him to get on a boat. His mother told him to stay and fight. And he said, finally, the train has gone. It's too late. He was arrested for gross indecency because this came out in court. His stuff came out in court. So now they have him. And, he's packing, et cetera. And so he's dragged into court. And Charles Gill, the prosecutor, talked about this poem that had been written. And he asked, what is the love that dare not speak its name? And that comes from, I think it's important to contextualize it. It's the last line of a poem from Lord Alfred Douglas, written in 92 from Bosie, published in the Oxford magazine. And it's quite emotional now to think about this, right? Here's a man who was at the heights. His own lover has architected his ruin unwittingly. In this feud with his father, and they're using his own lover's poem against him. And Wilde's response is lovely. I'm going to read it. He said, "The love that dare not speak its name in this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is that deep spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of art like those of Shakespeare and Michelangelo, and those two letters of mine, such as they are. It is in this century misunderstood, so much misunderstood that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name. And on that account of it, I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful. It is fine. It is the noblest form of affection. There's nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an older and a younger man. When the older man has intellect and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him, that it should be so, the world does not understand. The world mocks at it and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it." And that did not help his defense because it was reinforcing the charge.
That was very moving. Why is that not sort of used? Well, I guess it does talk about the older and the younger. To me, it seems like there's something in there that the sort of the LGBT community should be. It's so stirring and persuasive.
Yeah. It's tragic because he has to hedge a little bit.
Right.
He's talking about it in an intellectual sense, but he's making a profound case for a certain kind of love, which is still to this day frowned upon. We still to this day have a very serious issue with a lot of people will frown at you. You're 35, you're dating a 25-year-old. People. We're not in a that much of a different time.
Yeah.
So we're gonna move now to. Well, he was sentenced to 2 years hard labor in Reading jail. He was first in Newgate prison in London for processing. And when we talk about hard labor, we're talking about they would put them on these mills, and they would have to stand and walk these almost like water wheels for hours and hours and hours a day. I want you to imagine for a moment what that must have been like to go from the heights of London society into a room. I don't know the exact space, but they still have it now. They have the room set aside now as an artifact. This narrow room, with a cot. And thank goodness that, he had the kind of mind that he did, because he did spiritually somehow survive. And that is reflected in De Profundis, which I would encourage you to listen to in its entirety. They went to read it at the jail. The jail is no longer operating. It's an historical site now. But he wrote a 50,000 word letter, which is that's easily a novel.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's a novella.
Edging towards 200 pages. Yeah.
Yeah. It's more than a novella. That's a novel.
Mhm.
Yeah, between January and March, in 3 months of
Yeah.
1897, it is some of the most gorgeous writing you'll encounter. The reading that I found, I'll put the links in the show notes at artofdarkpod.com. And it's really worth listening to. It's 6.5 hours of one man reading the entire letter. And this actor, I'm going to look it up right now because I want to honor what he did. This actor, De Profundis, one moment.
I think you were saying it was Neil Bartlett.
Neil Bartlett, yes. And you might recognize him. He shows up. He breaks down reading it.
Really?
A number of times. And with no artifice, it simply moves you to tears to think about the tragedy of this.
Right. And him writing it in this small room after a day of, just mindless, arbitrary labor for labor's sake. And a man whose life philosophy was aestheticism, and who had reached a kind of an apotheosis in that regard as well, right?
It's tremendous, and it's really worth reading. We're all in a prison one way or another, and some more literally than others. But it is a journey, and he really has some spiritual moments in there. There's a lot. He talks about pain. He talks about the beauty of loss and how that might have been the lesson he was sent to teach Bosie. Something. It's really wonderful. He forgives him.
I appreciate you sharing that with me, because I'm going to check that out post haste. Yeah, really wonderful.
So he's released from prison, and he sailed that evening to France, and would never return to the United Kingdom. I
thought he died in prison. So okay. So he served his full 2 years, got out.
Correct. Well, and very, very, he had some very famously some last words, and we'll come to it. So he's exiled. He's going to write his final work, which is the Ballad of Reading Jail, and that's also read online. You can find that. That's worth hearing read. It is about seeing a hanging in the yard at Reading Jail, and there's some lovely. It's wonderful. It's of a kind of poetry we don't do anymore, right? It's this lyric poem, but once you get into the rhythm of it and all the rest, it's really wonderful. There's a line from it that I'm gonna read at some point here. That's just beautiful, and he talks about the man dancing at the gallows. Yeah, here it is. Yet each man kills the thing he loves. By each let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with the sword. Wonderful. Really worth listening to. Yeah. So I probably didn't.
There's something beautiful about that. And the true friend will stab you in the front. You can see the wit and the cleverness and brevity of that as compared to this, what you just read. Yeah, there's something in there about the development of this mind, basically.
The final act here really is that Wilde, if I'm to understand it, did reconcile with his wife. He was allowed to see his children. Which is rather moving to think of her grace and poise through this, how difficult that must have been to have that name so destroyed, and by association. And he would reconcile with Bosie. He requested a 6-month Catholic retreat, which was denied, and he wept. And he said he did intend to be received into the church before long. He ended up in so we'll finish here. We're closing. Douglas had been the cause of his misfortunes, right? Bosie. He and Wilde were reunited in August of 97 at Rouen. The friends and families were not happy with this. Constance was sending him money, was sending Oscar money, his wife.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And then during the latter part of 1897, Wilde and Douglas lived together near Naples for a month, and until their friends and family threatened to cut off the funds.
Wow.
So there was some love there, and they even
absolutely, yeah.
They reconciled, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, his final address was a dingy hotel, Hotel d'Alsace, now known as the Hotel, in the Rue de Beaux Arts. I don't know, my French is terrible. In Paris, and he said, "This poverty really breaks one's heart. It is so filthy, so utterly depressing, so hopeless. Pray do what you can," he wrote to his publisher. So he was really, really wrecked.
Yeah.
So he had little money. The little money he had, he spent on alcohol. It really broke him.
Yeah.
And he very famously said about this room, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has to go."
I'd heard that line before, but I'd never had that context.
Yeah. Well, so now we're into November of 1900, so it must be chilly in Paris. He developed meningitis, cerebral meningitis, and he was conditionally baptized into the Catholic Church by a priest from Dublin. And yeah, he was baptized. He died on the 30th of November, 1900. And he was buried in a cemetery in Paris. They were disinterred and moved to a different cemetery inside the city. And initially, he was buried outside Paris. His tomb is this wonderful kind of Art Deco sort of. It's like almost like a kind of a Sphinx character.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and people famously to this day cover it in lipstick kisses. They kiss it.
Okay,
yeah. In 2011, the tomb was cleaned of the many lipstick marks left there by admirers, and a glass barrier was installed to prevent further marks of damage. And the epitaph comes from the Ballad of Reading Gaol. "And alien tears will fill for him pity's long broken urn, for his mourners will be outcast men, and outcasts always mourn." Wow. All right. Wow. And Oscar Wilde lives on. His plays are performed, movies are made. He was pardoned in 2017 along with 50,000 men who were pardoned for homosexual acts. Yeah. Some people say a pardon is not enough. His family should be given a lot of money. The estate should be restored. I don't know all the details. He was given a stained glass window at Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, which is one of the highest honors that a writer could achieve in the UK. And if I'm not mistaken, there used to be a coffee house here in the Twin Cities called the Wilde Roast. It may still be open. I think they may have changed their name. Yeah. But you can't escape him. There's a sculpture in Dublin. He's well loved and rightly so. And Brad, what do you think Oscar Wilde would be doing today if he was around kicking?
Well, he'd probably be writing television, I have a feeling.
Right?
And I don't say that in a diminutive way. Like, God, he could have written a sitcom. Could you imagine given full reins of like a sitcom situation? He would have killed it. And Twitter, he'd be writing sitcoms and Twitter, and sometime in his life he would write like a great novel. I think that seems to me. But he would be attracting scandal. He wouldn't get arrested or convicted of anything and sent off to the prison camp. So we would get to enjoy his insanity. Not insanity. That's not fair. His I'm not even sure.
His individualism.
His individual,
We live at a time where that individualism is somehow conformist. The individualism is boxed inside Instagram and commodified, or it's in the context of this greater collective identity. This guy bucked trends. He did it his own way. He set the model for the rock star.
Yeah,
he created the idea of a literary rock star, a playwright.
Yeah, and I think I fear now that we would basically be like, oh, and here's this gay writer.
And that's how his legacy is often presented. What a tragic figure. He was accused of sodomy and tried and unjustly sent to prison and big bad patriarchy, da-da-da. It's way more nuanced and complicated than that. And tragic. He brought about his own downfall in a way.
Right.
And that's what makes it more bitter.
Mm-hmm. But, you know, I don't think a guy of that brilliance could be kept down for long. You know, I think he would poke his way through whatever gatekeeping was going on, and you would know his name if he were alive now. I have a feeling.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's wind down here and give our handles. So I'm Kevin Kautzman. It's Kautzman. I'm very active on Twitter. Brad, you are too, at
BradKelly, Brad Kelly.
This is the Art of Darkness podcast, and we hope you like it. This is only the second episode. The format is one of us is going to do a deep dive into an author, is going to read books and look up media about that author.
Yeah, we'll probably be going to other artists.
Artists. I just said author reflectively, but we focused on two artists to begin, and we're going to kind of almost give a little class to the other one about what's going on with that person, and hopefully through the course of it, you learn something. We also have a Twitter account, Art of Dark Pod, and then of course we're at artofdarkpod.com. I want to give Oscar the last word.
Yes,
I feel like I've kind of hung out with him for a little bit. You know, it's kind of wonderful. It makes me want to write some poems, and maybe I have some flashy clothes. I'm getting ready to go out to LA. I might dress up a little bit and kind of let it rip. You know, I think everything is so sort of boring these days. I think we need to go. So I'm going to do three of these. Men know life too early. Women know life too late. That is the difference between men and women. He who stands most remote from his age is he who mirrors it best.
Ooh.
I like that one. And let me find
that's
one.
Interesting.
I think that's quite good. I mean, and that of course plays into his mirror metaphor, which he loved. Yeah, let's see. Oh, this is lovely. Okay, two more because I really like this one.
Okay.
Everything in the world is about sex except sex. Sex is about power.
I've always loved that.
I love that. Yeah, it's so true. And this one's quite good. You don't love someone for their looks or their clothes or for their fancy car, but because they sing a song only you can hear.
Yeah. See, he had such sweetness to him as well.
He was a teddy bear. I don't think he was a bad guy. He certainly did not deserve what happened to him.
Yeah.
And the next time you watch Mike Tyson's Chronicles, you'll never see it the same way again.
Yeah. No, I've got real problems with the ghost of the Marquis de Queensberry. So,
all right, Brad. What are we thinking of doing next? What's up next?
I think the person I am thinking about most right now is Anna Kavan, who is she's, I guess, an English writer, though born in France. Born around the time that Oscar Wilde passed away, actually. So, an incredible writer, and we'll learn a little bit more about her. But she's just starting to get her due, though she's been passed away 50 or 60 years now. So.
And we only do dead artists and writers and poets and all the rest. So you don't have to worry. We're not going to go after anybody living.
Yeah.
that sounds wonderful, Brad. Well, I'm going to look forward to that. And our listeners can look forward to that too on Art of Darkness. All right.